The finish line was only 200 meters away when the first water bottle hit him. It struck his shoulder with a dull thud, the plastic cracking against bone, and Marcus stumbled but didn't stop. His legs were burning, his lungs screaming for air that wouldn't come clean anymore. And the crowd that had been cheering for the other runners had gone silent in the way that only hate makes possible. Someone laughed, then someone else. Then a man in an expensive running jacket cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted what they were all thinking. "This isn't for you, kid. Go home." Marcus was 14 years old. His shoes were held together with duct tape because the soles had separated from the canvas 3 weeks ago and his mother couldn't afford new ones. His race bib was safety pinned to a shirt that had belonged to his father, back when his father was still alive, back when the world made a different kind of sense. The number on his chest was 1847, and it flapped against his ribs with every labored step. His face was the color of brick dust, streaked with sweat and something that might have been tears, but could just as easily have been the mist from the water stations he'd passed 6 miles ago. The sun was setting behind the downtown buildings, casting long shadows across the asphalt, and in that golden-orange light Marcus looked like something carved from pain itself. Another bottle came. This one missed, skittering across the road in front of him, and Marcus had to adjust his stride to avoid it. The crowd pressed closer to the barriers. He could see their faces now, could see the way their lips curled, the way some of them held up their phones to record his humiliation. A woman in yoga pants leaned over the barrier and said something to her friend, and they both laughed, and the sound cut through the air like broken glass. Marcus kept running. His body wanted to stop. Every muscle fiber was voting for surrender, staging a rebellion against his will, but he pushed forward because stopping would mean they were right. Stopping would mean the last 6 months had been for nothing. The pain in his feet had transcended into something beyond physical sensation. Each impact sent shockwaves through bones that felt like they might shatter. The duct tape on his left shoe had come loose around mile 18, and now the sole flapped with every step, creating a rhythmic slapping sound that seemed to announce his poverty to everyone within earshot. He could feel blisters that had formed, burst, and formed again, could feel the wetness inside his shoes that might have been sweat or might have been blood, probably both. His toes had gone numb somewhere around mile 20, which he told himself was a mercy, even though he knew it meant he'd be paying for this tomorrow in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But tomorrow didn't matter. Only the next 200 meters mattered. Only the finish line mattered. Only keeping the promise mattered. The marathon had started at dawn, when the city was still wrapped in that particular stillness that comes just before the world wakes up. Marcus had stood in the back of the pack, surrounded by thousands of runners in their color-coordinated gear, their GPS watches, their hydration belts. Their faces full of confidence that came from knowing they belonged. He'd tried to make himself small, tried to blend into the crowd, but even then he'd felt the stares. A man in his 50s, gray-haired and fit, had looked him up and down and asked if he was lost. Marcus had shaken his head, kept his eyes on the ground. The man had walked away muttering something about kids these days, about participation trophies, about how back in his day you had to earn your place. Marcus had earned his place. He'd paid the entry fee with money he'd saved from mowing lawns all summer, from washing cars in the church parking lot on weekends, from skipping lunch at school, and pocketing the few dollars his mother pressed into his hand each morning even though he knew she needed them more. The registration had been $90. It might as well have been $9,000, but he'd done it. He'd signed up. He'd trained. And now he was here, standing at the starting line while grown men looked at him like he was trespassing on something sacred. The starting area had been a maze of privilege. Everywhere Marcus looked, he saw runners stretching in expensive compression gear, checking their heart rate monitors, discussing their training plans with coaches who wore branded jackets and carried tablets. He'd overheard conversations about nutrition strategies and altitude training camps and recovery protocols that sounded like they required both scientific degrees and unlimited bank accounts. A woman near him had been complaining to her friend about how her custom orthotics hadn't arrived in time, how she'd have to run in her backup shoes, the ones that only cost $300 instead of $4. Marcus had looked down at his own feet, at the canvas sneakers that had once been white but were now a mottled gray, at the duct tape that held the soles in place, and felt shame burn in his chest like acid. But then he'd thought about his father, about the promise, and the shame had transformed into something harder, something more like determination. The gun fired, and the pack surged forward, and Marcus let himself be carried along in the current of bodies. For the first few miles, he was anonymous. Just another number in a sea of numbers, another pair of feet hitting pavement in rhythm with 10,000 others. But marathons are long. They expose everything. By mile 7, the pack had thinned and spread, and Marcus found himself running alone in the space between groups. That's when the comments started. Runners passing him would glance over, see his taped-up shoes, his oversized shirt, his face too young and too brown and too poor for this world they'd built, and they'd say things, not always loud. Not always cruel in obvious ways, but enough. "You okay, buddy?" There's a shuttle bus back to the start. "This isn't a school fun run, you know. Someone should tell his parents this is dangerous." Marcus said nothing. He'd learned a long time ago that words didn't change minds. Only actions did. Only proof. Only the undeniable reality of success in the face of their doubt. So he kept his head down and focused on his breathing, on the rhythm his father had taught him years ago when they used to run together through their neighborhood at dawn, before the cancer came. Before everything fell apart. The breathing technique was simple but effective. In through the nose for 4 steps, out through the mouth for 4 steps. His father had learned it from a book about meditation and running, had practiced it until it became second nature, and then had taught it to Marcus on one of their early morning runs. "The breath is everything," his father had said, his own breathing steady, and even as they jogged through streets still dark with pre-dawn shadows. "Control your breath and you control your mind. Control your mind and you can control your body. Even when your body is screaming at you to stop." Marcus had been 8 years old then, small for his age, struggling to keep pace with his father's longer stride. But he'd practiced the breathing, had focused on the rhythm until it became automatic, until his lungs learned to expand and contract in perfect tempo with his feet. And now, 6 years later, with his father 4 years dead, and his body threatening to collapse, that breathing technique was one of the few things keeping him upright. One of the few threads connecting him to the man who taught him that pain was temporary, but pride lasted forever. His father had been a runner, not professionally. Not in any way that made money or earned recognition, but he'd loved it with the kind of pure devotion that doesn't need an audience. Every morning, before the sun came up, he'd lace up his shoes and slip out of their small apartment and run through streets that were still dark and quiet. And when Marcus turned 7, his father had started taking him along. They'd run slowly at first, just a mile or two, his father's hand sometimes reaching out to steady him when he stumbled, his father's voice always there with encouragement. "Pain is temporary, Marcus. The pride of finishing lasts forever." They'd run together for 3 years. 3 years of dawn light and empty streets and conversations about everything and nothing. His father would tell him stories while they ran, stories about his own childhood in Jamaica, about leaving everything behind to come to this country that promised so much and delivered so little. About learning to find joy in the small things, because the big things were often out of reach. And Marcus would listen, his small legs pumping to keep pace, his lungs learning to expand and contract in the rhythm of distance. Those morning runs had been sacred. Time carved out of a life that was otherwise consumed by work and bills, and the constant grinding pressure of trying to survive in a city that didn't care if you lived or died. Marcus's father had worked construction, long days in all weather, coming home with hands that were calloused and scarred, with a back that ached and knees that cracked when he climbed stairs. But no matter how tired he was, no matter how much pain he carried, he'd wake up before dawn and run. And when Marcus was old enough, he'd taken his son with him, sharing the one thing that was purely his, the 1 hour of the day when he wasn't David Johnson, the construction worker, the immigrant, the man struggling to make ends meet. He was just a runner, free and strong and alive. Marcus remembered one morning in particular, a winter morning when the temperature had dropped below freezing and ice glazed the sidewalks. He'd been 9 years old, and he'd complained about the cold, had wanted to stay in bed where it was warm. But his father had bundled him up in layers and taken him out anyway, and they'd run through streets that were empty and crystalline, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. And his father had pointed up at the sky, where stars were still visible in the pre-dawn darkness. "You see those stars, Marcus? They're the same stars my grandfather saw when he was your age, running through the mountains in Jamaica. The same stars that guided slaves to freedom. The same stars that have watched over runners for thousands of years." He'd paused, breath steady despite the cold and the pace. "When you run, you're part of something bigger than yourself. You're part of a long line of people who refuse to stay still, who refuse to accept the limitations the world tried to place on them." Marcus had thought about that a lot over the years. About being part of something bigger, about the long line of runners stretching back through history. And now, as he pushed through mile 7 and into mile 8, with his legs burning and strangers making comments about his inadequacy, he held onto that memory like a talisman. He was part of something bigger, he was keeping a promise, he was honoring a legacy. Then his father got sick, the kind of sick that comes fast and leaves no room for hope, pancreatic cancer. Stage 4 by the time they caught it. The doctors gave him 6 months and he made it 5, and during those 5 months Marcus watched the strongest man he'd ever known shrink into something fragile and gray. They stopped running. His father could barely walk to the bathroom by the end. The man who'd run 6 miles every morning without fail, who'd climbed scaffolding all day and still had energy to play with his son in the evening, was reduced to a skeleton in a hospital bed. Every breath a labor, every moment a negotiation with pain. Marcus had visited him every day after school, had sat beside that hospital bed and held his father's hand and tried not to cry, tried to be strong the way his father had taught him to be strong. But it was hard, so hard. Watching someone you love disappear piece by piece, watching the light in their eyes dim a little more each day, knowing there's nothing you can do to stop it. The cancer was relentless. It consumed his father from the inside, turning muscle into hollow spaces, turning strength into weakness, turning the man who'd seemed invincible into something breakable. The worst part wasn't the physical deterioration. It was watching his father's spirit struggle against the reality of dying. He'd always been a fighter. Always been the kind of man who refused to accept defeat. But cancer doesn't care about fighting spirit. It doesn't care about willpower or determination or how much you have left to live for. It just consumes. And as the weeks turned into months, Marcus watched his father's fight become less about winning and more about maintaining dignity, about facing the end with courage, about making sure his son understood that death doesn't diminish what you accomplished in life. But the night before he died, when the morphine had dulled the worst of the pain and his mind was clear for a few precious hours, he'd taken Marcus's hand and squeezed it with what little strength remained. "Promise me you'll keep running," he'd whispered, his voice thin and raspy, barely audible above the beeping of machines. "Promise me you'll run the marathon, the city marathon. The one I always talked about. Promise me you'll finish it for both of us," Marcus had promised. He'd been 10 years old, kneeling beside a hospital bed that smelled like disinfectant and dying, and he'd promised his father something that seemed impossible. The city marathon was 26.2 miles. It was for adults, for serious runners, for people with money and time and support systems. Not for a kid living in a one-bedroom apartment with his mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep them fed. Not for someone whose school didn't even have a track team. Not for him, but he'd promised. And in that moment, with his father's hand gripping his with desperate intensity, with tears streaming down both their faces, the impossibility hadn't mattered. The only thing that mattered was giving his father this one final piece of hope. This one thing to hold onto as the darkness closed in. So Marcus had said yes, had promised with everything he had sworn on his own life that he'd run the marathon, that he'd finish it, that he'd make his father proud. His father died 3 hours later. The machines had started beeping more urgently around 2 in the morning. Nurses rushed in. His mother pulled Marcus out of the room, held him in the hallway while doctors tried to do things that Marcus knew, even at 10 years old, were futile. And then a doctor emerged and spoke in that soft, practiced tone that medical professionals use when delivering death, and Marcus's mother collapsed against the wall, sobbing. And Marcus just stood there feeling numb. Feeling like the world had ended, but somehow was still spinning, feeling like he'd lost the most important part of himself and would spend the rest of his life trying to find it again. The funeral was a blur. Marcus barely remembered it. Remembered standing in a church that seemed too bright and too loud. Remembered people saying things about his father that were true but felt empty. Remembered being hugged by strangers who smelled like perfume and sadness. Remembered the cemetery, the coffin being lowered into the ground, his mother's hand trembling in his, the impossible finality of dirt being shoveled onto the box that contained his father's body. He remembered thinking that running 6 miles every morning should have made his father immortal. That all that strength and discipline and life should have counted for something more than ending up in a hole in the ground. And he kept the promise in his heart like a stone, heavy and immovable, through the funeral he barely remembers and the months of grief that followed and the slow, painful adjustment to a life that felt smaller and colder without his father's presence. His mother tried. She worked her morning shift at the diner and her evening shift at the grocery store, and came home smelling like grease and exhaustion. And she'd hold Marcus while he cried and tell him his father would be so proud. But she didn't understand about the promise. She didn't know about the marathon. Marcus didn't tell her. Part of it was not wanting to worry her. She had enough to deal with, working herself to exhaustion just to keep them housed and fed, navigating a world that seemed designed to punish people who were already struggling. But part of it was something else, something more private. The promise was between him and his father, sacred ground that didn't need to be shared or explained. So he kept it to himself, carried it quietly, let it become the organizing principle of his life. He just started running again, alone this time. Before school, when the world was still dark, and the streets belonged to stray cats and delivery trucks. He'd wear his father's old running shoes, the ones that were too big and gave him blisters. And he'd run until his legs gave out, and then he'd walk home and shower in cold water because the hot water heater had broken and they couldn't afford to fix it. He taught himself to run longer, farther, through pain and heat and the kind of exhaustion that makes your vision blur. He read books about training from the library. He watched videos on the computers at school during lunch. He learned about pacing and hydration and the wall that every marathoner hits around mile 20, the point where the body runs out of easy fuel and starts consuming itself. The library became his training ground as much as the streets did. He'd spend hours reading about marathon physiology, about how to build endurance, about nutrition and recovery and injury prevention. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, had noticed his interest and started setting aside books for him, running biographies, training manuals, even scientific journals about athletic performance that were probably meant for college students, but that Marcus read anyway, looking up words he didn't understand, teaching himself the vocabulary of distance running. He learned that the marathon distance, 26.2 miles, came from the legend of Phidippides, the Greek messenger who ran from Marathon to Athens to announce victory over the Persians. Phidippides had collapsed and died after delivering his message, which Marcus thought was both inspiring and terrifying. He learned about glycogen depletion and the importance of long, slow runs for building aerobic capacity. He learned that most marathon training plans were 16 to 20 weeks long and required running 5 or 6 days a week, with gradually increasing mileage. He learned that proper running shoes were supposed to be replaced every 300 to 500 miles, which meant he was running on shoes that were long past their expiration date. Shoes that offered no support and probably contributed to the shin splints that plagued him for months. But he couldn't afford new shoes. His mother was already stretched too thin, working double shifts just to cover rent and groceries and the mountain of medical bills that had accumulated during his father's illness. So Marcus made do. He stuffed newspaper into the shoes to provide cushioning. He wrapped his shins in ace bandages he'd stolen from the school nurse's office. He learned to run through pain because pain was constant, and if he let it stop him, he'd never run at all. He trained for 4 years, through middle school and into high school, through growth spurts that made his joints ache, and winters that froze his lungs and summers that baked the sidewalks until they shimmered. He ran in rain and snow and heat that made other people stay inside. He ran when kids at school made fun of him for being skinny, for being poor, for spending his lunch breaks jogging around the parking lot instead of sitting with them in the cafeteria. He ran when his mother's hours got cut, and they had to move to an even smaller apartment in a worse neighborhood. He ran when the electricity got shut off, and when the eviction notices came, and when the world seemed determined to prove that people like him didn't get to chase dreams, they only got to survive. The teasing at school had been relentless. Marcus was naturally thin, and 4 years of distance running had made him even more so. He looked gaunt, all angles and lean muscle, and in a culture that valued bulk and strength, he became an easy target. Boys called him skeleton and marathon man with sneering voices. They'd mock his dedication, couldn't understand why anyone would choose to spend their free time running in circles. "What are you training for, Ethiopia?" one particularly cruel classmate had asked, and the cafeteria had erupted with laughter. Marcus had walked away, face burning, fists clenched at his sides. But the mockery only made him more determined. Every insult became fuel. Every laugh became motivation. He'd channel the anger and humiliation into his training, pushing himself harder, running faster, adding miles. His body became a machine built for one purpose, covering 26.2 miles. His resting heart rate dropped into the 40s. His legs became corded with muscle that could fire for hours without failing. His lungs expanded until he could breathe in rhythm for miles without conscious thought. The neighborhood they'd moved to after the eviction was rougher than their previous one. More crime. More desperation. Streets where you learn to keep your head down and your valuables hidden. Marcus ran through it every morning in the dark, and sometimes people would shout at him from porches or doorways. "Where you running to, boy? You stealing something?" Once, a group of guys had chased him for 3 blocks, thinking he'd done something wrong, but Marcus had outrun them easily. His endurance was too great, his determination too fierce. They'd given up panting and cursing while Marcus had barely broken his stride. And then, finally, he turned 14. Old enough to register for the marathon, old enough to make good on his promise. He'd saved the money, he'd done the training. He'd run hundreds of miles in preparation, most of them alone, all of them carrying the weight of his father's memory. The morning of the race, he'd stood in front of the mirror in their tiny bathroom and pinned his father's shirt to his chest and looked at himself and wondered if he was ready. He didn't feel ready. He felt terrified, but ready wasn't the point. Keeping the promise was the point. His mother had been sleeping when he left. She worked late on Friday nights, didn't get home until after midnight, and Marcus hadn't wanted to wake her. Hadn't wanted to explain where he was going or why. Hadn't wanted to see the worry in her eyes or hear her tell him it was too dangerous, that he was too young, that he should wait. So he'd slipped out quietly, left a note on the kitchen counter that said he'd be back by afternoon, and walked to the bus stop in darkness. The bus ride downtown had been surreal. Watching the city wake up around him. Watching other runners board at various stops, all of them with their expensive gear and their confident faces, all of them looking at him like he was lost. He'd clutched his race bib in his hand, kept his eyes on the window, tried to slow his racing heart, tried to remember everything he'd learned. Tried to feel his father's presence beside him, the way he had on all those morning runs years ago. Now at mile 23, with 3 miles left, and his body screaming and the crowd jeering and someone throwing bottles, Marcus understood that the physical distance was the easy part. The hard part was running through their hate. The hard part was keeping his legs moving when everything around him was designed to make him stop. A man in expensive sunglasses jogged past him, easily, barely breathing hard, and as he passed, he looked back over his shoulder and said, "You're embarrassing yourself, kid. Have some dignity and drop out." Marcus didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat was too dry, his mouth full of the metallic taste of exhaustion, but he didn't stop either. He pushed through mile 23 and into mile 24, and the crowd grew larger as he approached downtown. As the course funneled into the final stretch, where everyone gathered to watch the finishers. This was supposed to be the moment of glory, the part where the spectators cheer and ring cowbells and hold up signs and make you feel like a hero. But for Marcus, it became something else entirely. It became a gauntlet. The jeering grew louder, more organized. A group of college-aged runners who'd finished earlier were standing near the 24-mile marker, still in their gear, medals around their necks. And as Marcus approached, they started a slow clap. Mocking, sarcastic. "Come on, kid, you can do it, only 2 more miles." Their voices dripped with contempt. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered with a fraternity logo on his shirt, stepped closer to the barrier and cupped his hands around his mouth. "Seriously, though, this isn't for you. You don't belong here." Marcus felt something crack inside him, not his will. His will was iron, but something else. Some small, fragile part of him that still hoped the world might be kind. He felt tears mix with the sweat on his face, and he hated himself for it. Hated that they could see him break even this much. Hated that his body was betraying him when he needed it most. But he didn't stop running. His father had taught him that. Pain is temporary, pride lasts forever. The tears came unbidden, flowing freely now, and Marcus couldn't wipe them away because his arms were too heavy, because any deviation from the mechanical act of running might cause complete collapse. So he let them flow, let the college boys see him cry, let them think they'd won, because he knew something they didn't. He knew that crying while moving forward was not the same as quitting. He knew that tears were just water leaving the body, that they didn't diminish the promise he was keeping, that they didn't change the fact that he was still running, still pushing, still refusing to stop. Mile 25 arrived like a slow death. His legs had stopped feeling like legs and started feeling like abstract concepts, things attached to his body but no longer under his control. Each step was a negotiation, each breath was a battle. The world narrowed to a tunnel, just the road ahead and the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears like a drum counting down to something. He could see the finish line now, maybe half a mile away, marked by a giant inflatable arch and crowds pressed against barriers and cameras and officials in bright vests. So close. Close enough to taste. His vision had started to blur around the edges, gray spots dancing in his peripheral vision, warning signs that his body was approaching its absolute limit. Marcus knew enough about physiology to recognize the symptoms of extreme exhaustion, the trembling in his hands, the way his thoughts had become slow and thick, like trying to think through honey. The sensation that he was watching himself from outside his body, some part of his consciousness floating above and behind, observing this foolish child destroying himself for a promise. But that floating consciousness also saw something else, saw the inflatable arch in the distance, saw the finish line that was so close now, saw that he'd come too far to quit. And so the body kept moving even as the mind threatened to shut down. The legs kept pumping even though they'd transcended pain into something more like a void. The lungs kept pulling in air even though each breath felt like fire. That's when he heard the voice, different from the others, quieter. "Marcus," he looked up, squinting through the sweat and exhaustion, and saw an old man standing near the barrier. Older than old, ancient. Skin like weathered leather, white hair, dressed in a simple button-down shirt and slacks that looked like they'd been pressed that morning. He was holding a water bottle, arm extended toward Marcus, and his eyes were steady and clear in a way that cut through the chaos. "Marcus," the man said again, and this time Marcus heard something in his voice that made him slow down. That made him reach for the water, even though he'd been planning to push straight through to the finish. He took the bottle, drank. The water was cool and perfect, and for a moment the world stopped being cruel. "Your father would be proud," the old man said, and his voice was so certain, so absolute, that Marcus felt something shift in his chest. He tried to speak, tried to ask how this stranger knew his father's name, knew his name, but the man just nodded once and stepped back, and Marcus was moving again. Pulled forward by momentum and promise, and the finish line that was right there, so close he could hear the announcer's voice crackling through the speakers. The water had given him something. Not energy exactly, his body was beyond energy, running on pure will now, but clarity, focus. The blurring at the edges of his vision receded slightly. The gray spots retreated, and with that small restoration of awareness came a flood of emotion so powerful it threatened to buckle his knees. He was going to finish. After 4 years of training alone, after 4 years of carrying his father's death like a weight in his chest, after 4 years of being mocked and doubted, and told he didn't belong. He was going to finish. The final quarter mile was a blur of pain and determination and noise. The crowd was massive now, thousands of people packed along both sides of the street, and their voices crashed over him like waves. Some were cheering, most were not. He heard his number called out, heard someone say, "That's the kid, the one who's been struggling all day." Heard laughter and pity and scorn all mixed together. He heard the man in the expensive running jacket again, closer now, voice rising above the others. "This is pathetic. Someone should disqualify him for his own good." And then, cutting through everything, another voice. This one coming from the speakers, from the announcer's booth overlooking the finish line. Loud. Official, amplified across the entire plaza. "Ladies and gentlemen, as runner 1847 approaches the finish, I want to share something special about this young man." The crowd noise dipped. Not silent but curious. Even the mockers paused, confused by the shift in tone. "Marcus Johnson," the announcer continued, and Marcus felt his name echo across the downtown streets, felt it bounce off buildings and roll through crowds, "is 14 years old. He trained for this marathon alone. No coach, no team, no running club. He saved money from odd jobs to pay his entry fee. He runs in shoes held together with tape because he can't afford new ones. And he's running today to honor a promise he made to his father, who died 4 years ago from cancer. His father's dying wish was for Marcus to run this marathon, to finish it. And Marcus has spent 4 years training alone to keep that promise." The silence that followed was complete, total, as if every person in the crowd had simultaneously forgotten how to make sound. Marcus kept running, his vision blurred, his chest heaving, his legs moving on pure will now, nothing left in the tank except the promise itself. His father's name was David Johnson, the announcer said, and his voice had gone soft now, reverent, the kind of tone you use in churches and at graves. David was a runner himself, a beloved member of our local running community. He used to volunteer at this very marathon, manning water stations, cheering on runners, spreading joy. Many of you probably remember him. He had a smile that could light up a room. And when he got sick, when the cancer took him too soon, his final wish was for his son to experience the pride of crossing this finish line. Today, Marcus is doing that. Today, Marcus is keeping his promise. Marcus could see faces now, pressed against the barriers, and they looked different than they had before. Softer, some were crying. A woman in a running jacket, one of the ones who'd passed him earlier with a dismissive comment, had her hand over her mouth, eyes wide with something that looked like shame. The college boys who'd mocked him were staring at the ground. The man in expensive sunglasses who'd told him to drop out was standing frozen, face pale. Marcus has maintained a 7-minute per mile pace despite wearing inadequate equipment and running without any support crew, the announcer continued. That's a 3-hour and 4-minute marathon, ladies and gentlemen, at 14 years old, with taped-up shoes. Alone, that's not just impressive, that's extraordinary. The crowd erupted. Not with mockery this time, with something else. Something that sounded like redemption, like collective guilt being transformed into desperate cheering. Like a stadium full of people, suddenly realizing they'd been on the wrong side of something important. They screamed his name. They rang bells and blew horns, and Marcus could feel the sound lifting him, carrying him, pushing him toward the finish line that was now just steps away. He crossed it at 3 hours, 4 minutes and 18 seconds. His legs gave out immediately after, buckling like they'd been waiting for permission to quit, and volunteers rushed forward to catch him before he hit the pavement. They wrapped him in a thermal blanket and gave him water, and someone was trying to put a medal around his neck, but Marcus couldn't feel his arms, couldn't feel anything except the absence of pain. The sudden strange emptiness that comes when you've been hurting for so long that stopping hurts too. "Son," the voice was close, familiar. Marcus looked up and saw the old man from the barrier, the one who'd given him water, standing there with race officials and people in suits that looked important. "Son, can you hear me?" Marcus nodded, tried to speak. His voice came out as a whisper. "How did you know my father?" The old man smiled, and it was sad and warm at the same time. "I'm Richard Chen. I'm the race director, have been for 30 years. Your father volunteered at this marathon every year for a decade. He was one of the best people I ever knew. When he got sick, he called me. Told me his son was going to run one day, made me promise I'd watch for you, made me promise I'd make sure people understood." He paused, eyes glistening. "I've been waiting 4 years for you to show up, Marcus, watching the registration lists. And when I saw your name this year, saw that you'd registered from your mother's address, I knew it was time. Marcus felt something break loose in his chest. Something that had been locked tight since his father died. Tears came hot and fast, and he didn't try to stop them. Richard Chen knelt down beside him, put a hand on his shoulder. "Your father was right about you, son. He said you were the strongest person he'd ever met. He said you'd finish this race no matter what, and he was right." The crowd was still cheering. The sound was deafening. Marcus looked out at them, at all these people who jeered and mocked and thrown bottles. And now they were clapping and crying, and some were even bowing their heads like they were in the presence of something holy. The man in the expensive running jacket was standing at the barrier with tears streaming down his face, mouth moving in what looked like an apology Marcus couldn't hear. The college boys were gone, disappeared into the crowd, their medals abandoned on the ground. A reporter pushed through with a camera crew, microphone extended. "Marcus, Marcus, how do you feel? What do you want to say to everyone watching?" Marcus took a shaking breath, looked at the camera, thought about his father. Thought about all the mornings they'd run together through dark streets, all the promises made and kept. Thought about his mother working 2 jobs so he could eat. Thought about the 4 years of training alone, of being told he didn't belong, of pushing through when everything said to stop. "I want to say," he started, voice still weak but growing stronger, "that marathons aren't about how much money you have or what shoes you wear or whether people think you belong. They're about promises, they're about love, they're about finishing what you start even when the whole world tells you to quit." He paused, wiped his eyes. "My dad taught me that. He taught me that the only person who gets to decide if you belong somewhere is you. And I belonged here today. I belonged here because I earned it, because I trained for it. Because I promised." The reporter tried to ask another question, but Richard Chen waved her off gently. "Give the boy some space," he said. "He just did something most adults couldn't do." He turned back to Marcus. "Come on, let's get you to medical, make sure you're okay, and then I want you to meet some people, other runners. People who knew your father, people who want to apologize." They helped Marcus to his feet, and he walked, slowly, supported by volunteers, toward the medical tent. As he passed through the crowd, people reached out to touch his shoulder, to whisper encouragement, to say they were sorry. The woman in yoga pants who'd laughed was standing at the barrier sobbing, trying to make eye contact with him, but Marcus looked away. Not because he was angry. He was too tired to be angry. But because her apology wasn't the point. Her guilt wasn't the point. The point was the promise. The point was the finish line. The point was proving that belonging isn't something other people grant you. It's something you claim for yourself. In the medical tent, they checked his vitals, gave him electrolytes, examined his feet, which were raw and bleeding inside the taped-up shoes. A doctor, middle-aged and kind-faced, shook her head in amazement. "You should be in worse shape," she said. "Most people running their first marathon in improper equipment would have collapsed miles ago. What kept you going?" Marcus thought about the question, about his father's hand in his. About dawn runs through empty streets, about promises that outlive the people who make them. "Love," he said simply, "just love." They let him rest for an hour. His mother arrived, pulled away from her shift at the diner by a call from race officials who tracked down her number. She burst into the medical tent and grabbed Marcus, and held him so tight he could barely breathe. And she was crying and laughing and yelling at him all at once for not telling her what he was doing. For taking such a risk, for being so brave, for making her so proud. He held her back and felt, for the first time in years, like maybe they were going to be okay. Like maybe the grief that had defined them for so long was finally making room for something else. Something lighter. Richard Chen returned as the sun was setting, the plaza outside emptying as runners and spectators dispersed into the city. He came with an envelope. "Marcus, there's something you should know. Your father's friends, the running community that knew and loved him, they've been contributing to a fund ever since he died. They wanted to make sure that when you ran the marathon, you'd have support, proper equipment, maybe even a college fund." He handed Marcus the envelope. "There's $47,000 in here. From people who remembered your father's kindness, from people who want to honor his memory by helping his son." Marcus stared at the envelope like it was a foreign object. "I don't understand. Your father touched a lot of lives, son. He was the kind of person who made everyone feel seen, feel valued. When he died, people wanted to do something." "This is that something," Richard Chen smiled. Use it for school, use it for proper running shoes, use it to keep running because you have real talent. But mostly use it to know that you're not alone. You were never alone. Your father made sure of that. Marcus opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a check and a letter handwritten, signed by dozens of people. Names he didn't recognize, names his father had never mentioned. All of them sharing stories about David Johnson, about his smile and his encouragement, and his belief that running was about community, about lifting each other up. The letter ended with a simple sentence. "We see you, Marcus. We always have." He folded the letter carefully and looked up at Richard Chen. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. "No, son," Richard Chen replied. "Thank you. You reminded us what this is supposed to be about. You reminded us that marathons aren't exclusive clubs for people with money and privilege. They're celebrations of human endurance and will. They're about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. You showed us that today. You showed all those people who mocked you what real strength looks like." Later, after his mother took him home and helped him into a hot bath and made him soup even though it was too late for dinner, and she had to be back at work in 6 hours. Marcus sat in their small apartment and looked at his father's picture on the wall. It was old, faded, taken back when they used to run together. His father was smiling in it, sweat-stained and happy, arm around young Marcus, both of them in running clothes. Marcus touched the frame gently. "I did it, Dad," he whispered. "I kept my promise, I finished." The picture didn't respond, but Marcus felt something anyway, something warm and certain and steady. He felt his father's pride. He felt it in the ache of his muscles and the rawness of his feet and the metal hanging from his bedpost. He felt it in the memory of crossing that finish line, of proving to everyone and to himself that belonging isn't about what others think of you. It's about what you know of yourself. The next morning, Marcus woke up unable to walk. His legs had seized during the night, muscles locked in protest against the punishment he'd put them through. His mother had to help him to the bathroom, and she laughed through worried tears and told him he was insane and wonderful in equal measure. But as she helped him back to bed, she paused and looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen since his father died. Pride, pure, uncomplicated pride. "Your father knew," she said quietly. "He always said you'd do something that mattered, something that changed things." She brushed hair from his forehead like she used to when he was small. "You did that yesterday, baby. You changed things." Marcus wasn't sure if that was true. He'd just run a race, kept a promise. But over the following days, as his story spread through the city and then beyond, he started to understand what his mother meant. Emails came, letters. Messages from kids in similar situations, from poor families and broken homes and places where dreams seemed impossible. They told him he'd inspired them. They told him he'd shown them that barriers only exist if you believe in them. They told him they were going to try now, try harder, try impossible things. The man in the expensive running jacket reached out through the race director's office. His name was Peter Carlson, and he was a corporate attorney who'd run 15 marathons and considered himself part of the marathon elite. His message was brief and devastated with shame. He apologized. He explained that he'd been wrong, that he'd let privilege and assumption cloud his judgment, that he'd never forgive himself for telling Marcus to quit. He included a donation to a youth running program in Marcus's name. $5,000, more money than Marcus had ever seen donated to anything. The college boys sent a group apology video. Awkward and sincere, they talked about how they'd been raised to think marathons were for certain kinds of people. How they'd never questioned that assumption until they watched Marcus cross the finish line and felt their own shame rise up like bile. They pledged to volunteer at future races, to mentor kids from underprivileged backgrounds to be better. Marcus watched the video once and then deleted it, not because he didn't accept their apology, but because he didn't need it. His closure hadn't come from their guilt, it had come from his own achievement. Richard Chen called 2 weeks later with an offer. The marathon organization wanted Marcus to be the face of their youth initiative. They wanted him to speak at schools, to mentor young runners, to show kids that the marathon wasn't just for wealthy adults with expensive gear. They'd pay him. Not much, but enough to help his mother cut back her hours at the grocery store. Enough to buy him proper running shoes and training gear. Enough to start building towards something. Marcus accepted. And over the months that followed, he found himself standing in front of classrooms and community centers, telling his story to kids who looked just like him. Poor kids, immigrant kids. Kids whose parents worked multiple jobs and whose shoes had holes and whose dreams felt too big for the small spaces they occupied. He told them about his father, about promises, about the difference between belonging and being welcomed, about how you claim space in this world not by waiting for permission, but by showing up and refusing to leave. He ran another marathon the following year, this time with proper shoes. This time with a support crew of his mother and Richard Chen, and a dozen volunteers from the running community who'd known his father. This time the crowd cheered his name from start to finish, and when he crossed the line at 2 hours and 53 minutes, breaking 3 hours at age 15, the entire plaza erupted with joy. He'd shaved 11 minutes off his time. He'd proven that the first marathon wasn't a fluke, wasn't just adrenaline and grief and stubbornness. It was talent, real talent. College coaches reached out. Scholarship offers came. Marcus's life, which had seemed so narrow and predetermined, suddenly filled with possibilities that had seemed impossible just a year before. But he never forgot that first marathon. He never forgot the water bottles thrown at him, the jeers, the faces twisted with contempt. He kept them in his memory not as wounds but as fuel. As proof that the world will always try to tell certain people they don't belong, and as proof that those people can prove the world wrong. On the 4th anniversary of his father's death, Marcus ran alone through their old neighborhood at dawn, following the same routes they'd taken when he was small. The world was quiet and dark, the way it used to be, and Marcus let himself remember everything. The sound of his father's breathing beside him. The stories about Jamaica and hope and finding joy in small things. The final promise in a hospital room that smelled like ending. He ran until the sun came up, until the streets filled with the noise of a waking city. And then he stopped in front of his old apartment building and looked up at the window where his father used to watch him practice. "I'm still running, Dad," he said to the empty air. "I'm still keeping the promise." The window didn't respond. But the sun did, breaking through clouds and spilling gold across the street. And Marcus felt his father's presence in that light the way you feel warmth on your skin, undeniable and absolute. He thought about all the people who'd told him he didn't belong, all the voices that had tried to make him quit, all the barriers that had been placed in his path, not because he wasn't capable, but because people like him weren't supposed to dream this big. And he thought about how none of it had mattered in the end, how the only voice that mattered was his own, how the only permission he'd ever needed was the permission he gave himself. The marathon had changed him, not because he'd won, he hadn't won, he'd finished in the middle of the pack, unremarkable by competitive standards, but because he'd finished. Because he'd proven that the line between possible and impossible is thinner than most people think. Because he'd learned that strength isn't about being the fastest or the best equipped or the most supported. Strength is about showing up when everything tells you to stay home. Strength is about running through hate until it transforms into respect. Strength is about keeping promises even when the person who asked you to make them is gone. So here's what I need you to understand. Here's what matters. The world will tell you that some things aren't for you. That marathons or colleges or careers or dreams are reserved for people who look a certain way, who come from certain places, who have certain advantages. The world will throw bottles at you when you try anyway. It will mock and jeer and tell you to go home. It will make you feel small and unwelcome and wrong. But the world is wrong. You belong anywhere you have the courage to show up. You belong anywhere you're willing to work and sacrifice and endure. You belong because you decide you belong, not because anyone else gives you permission. And when you cross that finish line, when you achieve that impossible thing, the same people who tried to stop you will cheer. They'll claim they always believed in you. They'll pretend they never doubted. Don't do it for them. Don't do it for their approval or their applause or their guilty apologies. Do it for the people who loved you when you were nothing. Do it for the promises you made. Do it for the small, stubborn voice inside you that says you can. Marcus Johnson ran a marathon at 14 years old in tape-top shoes while grown men threw bottles at him and told him he didn't belong. He finished in 3 hours and 4 minutes. He kept his promise, He proved them all wrong, not because he was special or gifted or chosen, but because he refused to believe that his poverty or his age or their contempt meant anything about what he could achieve. You can do the same, whatever your marathon is. Whatever promise you're carrying, whatever finish line seems impossibly far away, you can do it, not because it'll be easy, not because people will cheer, but because you're stronger than the voices that say you're not, because you belong wherever you decide to belong. And because somewhere, someone who loved you is watching, believing in you, waiting for you to cross that line and prove to yourself what they always knew. That you were never too small, too poor, too young, too wrong. You were always exactly enough. Now run.